So welcome everyone. My name is Nick Valesky. I work for our Utah State University Extension Integrated Pest Management Program. And I'm the one that's coordinating these vegetable IPM winter webinars. So this year's series, we're gonna be geared towards Utah's commercial and small urban farmers, along with home gardeners. So it's gonna be a lot of good information for everyone watching. And then tonight's webinar is going to specifically cover common diseases and insect pests of leafy green crops. So this includes arugula, collards, kales, and mustards in the brassica family, and then various bib, cos, iceberg, and leaf lettuces, along with beet greens, spinach, and Swiss chards. Leafy greens, they're super popular and easy to grow on Utah farms, and they're mostly a cool season crop vegetable that usually is done best in the spring and fall. So a few reminders, you guys are watching this as a Zoom webinar, so you don't have access to your camera or microphone, but please feel free to leave any comments or questions in the chat box, which some of you have been doing already. And this webinar, it's going to be recorded and it'll be available on our USU Extension YouTube channel, along with our USU Extension Utah Pest website. So when you registered for this, and if you requested a pesticide use CEU through the Utah Department of Ag and Food, we'll have questions at the end of this presentation that you can answer to earn that credit. And I'll explain more about that at the end. So I'm now going to give the time over to my boss and supervisor, Mare Murray. She is our Extension IPM specialist for the state of Utah, and she is going to talk about some diseases of our leafy green crops.
Thank you, Nick. I want to tell everyone how much we love Nick and Extension. He's just doing a great job, and we're just so happy to have him. So, I would like to actually make one more comment about the chat box. As Nick said, feel free to ask questions in chat and we'll get to them as we see them. But when you type your message, you'll see there's a drop-down menu right above there. If you click on that, you can send a message to all panelists or all panelists and attendees or to specific people. So it's nice if everyone can see your question. So if you select all panelists and attendees, then that would be great. Okay, so as Nick said, I'm going to talk about diseases of leafy green vegetables. And so I was thinking about, we don't have a lot of diseases in general on our plants in Utah, and in particular on the leafy green vegetables. So I was thinking about how to present them, and I decided to break them up by how often they occur. And if any questions come up that aren't really pertinent to what I'm talking about, we'll get to them later. So there's an aphid question, and we'll get to that later. So I broke it out by very common, there's none, somewhat common, and then down to rare. So we'll start with the disease that's somewhat common, and this is in particular if you're growing your plants from seedlings. So it's a disease called damping off, and it's caused by a mix of soil-borne pathogens. Pythium, you might have heard of that, is the most common that causes damping off, but there are others as well. And these pathogens have a very, very wide host range, but they can also affect most of the leafy green vegetables that you might grow. So this is a video from the American Phytopathological Society. It's a disease society that I pulled from the internet, and it's just showing that this structure right here is the resting structure of this pathogen, and under the right conditions, it will form what's called a fruiting body, which is where the spores are created inside. And the right conditions would be the right temperatures and the presence of those seedlings you're trying to grow. So in that fruiting body, and again, this is an example of Pythium or Phytophthora, the spores are being developed and they actually swim. So that kind of tells you, okay, this this particular pathogen needs saturated soils, it needs water for them to get around. So the spores swim and they're able to detect the presence of the seedling roots that are in the soil. And so they find their way to the roots, and they do not need a wound or anything like that to penetrate into the root tissue. They have some specialized parts of the fungal body that enables them to penetrate in without a wound. And so once they get inside the plant, and these black dots are just showing that it's killing the plant tissue and causes disease. So the symptoms, of course, are just the plants wilting over, but the kind of caved in or pinched in appearance of the stem is classic damping off conditions. And that's that dead tissue right at the stem. The stem is not able to hold any water anymore. And so small, tiny, newly formed seedlings can be affected, as well as a little bit older plants as well. All right, so when I talk about these diseases, I'm going to show the symptoms and then talk a little bit about management. So for damping off and for a lot of diseases, the management is prevention, preventing the disease from happening in the first place. And so if you look at that picture in the bottom, you can see there's some seedlings there, and the soil looks pretty wet. So there's some standing water there, and there's some small seedlings that have toppled over from damping off. So only water when needed, and these should be removed immediately. If you're going to reuse your pots, sterilize them. And the way to go would be to soak them for about an hour in a 10% bleach solution. And if you're growing your seedlings in an area that you're growing year to year, be sure and sterilize those surfaces as well. And you can just, again, use a 10% bleach solution and just let it dry. And if you want to grow your seedlings on the ground, whether you have a greenhouse space that has a dirt floor, or you're growing it outside on the ground, just make sure you have some kind of barrier between the bottom of the pot and the dirt on the ground, because these pathogens are actually ubiquitous. They are everywhere. And then finally, there is an option where you can use a biological fungicide and mix it in with the media that you're planting the seedlings. If you're just feeling like you can't really get rid of the damping off from your seedling culture. And so it's called mycostop, and it's made up of a bacteria that's naturally occurring in the soil called Streptomyces. And what the bacteria does is it colonizes those seedling roots just as they start coming out. And so it competes with any pathogens in the media or in the soil for space on the roots. It's antagonistic towards the pathogens, and it creates toxins against the pathogens. Okay, so that's really the only kind of somewhat common disease. So now we're into the less common or uncommon, and I'll start with gray mold. And I'm showing this picture of a strawberry. And there's a question, can I increase the volume a little? Nick, am I coming through okay? You think so?
Sorry, my mic was off. So yeah, you guys are good. If you guys are having trouble hearing, try turning the volume up on your computer or whatever device you're listening on.
And I'll just hold this a little closer. I don't know if that helps or not. But yeah, continue to let me know if there's any problems with audio. But, how about, is this any better? I'm told that, okay, I'll hold this right here and see if that is better. All right, thanks guys. Okay, so another one that's uncommon, gray mold. And I'm showing the picture of the strawberry. It's not a leafy green, only because maybe you're familiar with this disease because it can be somewhat common in strawberry production, or maybe you have purchased some strawberries somewhere and then it kind of turned into a little puddle of mush and spores. So that would be the same disease that I'm going to talk about. And it's caused by a fungus called botrytis. And it survives on crop debris over the winter. And so that's how it can just continue the cycle of causing new infections the following spring. But it's different because it's only going to be causing infections under the right conditions, cool or humid conditions. So these conditions are more common in high tunnels, maybe cooler greenhouses, or tightly packed field conditions. So the mic is like, okay, right here, is this perfect?
That's good.
Okay. I had to, sorry guys, I had to, my microphone on my computer is not working. So I had to scramble and find something, find an alternative. Okay, so botrytis, it needs a wound to enter and cause infection on the plant. So it can't enter the plant on its own. So it needs a wound or senescing tissue, and it has a very wide host range. But within the leafy greens, lettuce is the most common host. So I have a question here from Amy. So if I start a seedling directly in the garden boxes, will the pathogens naturally be in the soil? So if you are reusing soil in your outdoor garden boxes, then yes, the pathogens can find their way into that soil. If you're using sterile soil, potting mix, it's typically not going to be there. But if you introduce that potting mix outside, then the pathogens can enter. All right, so botrytis symptoms would initially start out with kind of a soft, wet rot on the foliage, and it just kind of collapse. And then eventually the foliage will dry up and feel a little bit papery. But if you look down within, for example, in the middle of this lettuce planting here, or at the base of plants is where you'll see some spores forming. And that's the thing about botrytis. It forms millions and millions of spores. And so once it's present, it can spread very quickly. So this is another video that I came across online, and all these little round, like lollipop structures at the top, those are all called fruiting bodies, meaning they harbor the spores themselves. So each one of those little round structures can have hundreds and hundreds of spores. So this just kind of give you an idea of the number of spores that can be released from a single botrytis infection. All right, so managing gray mold. Two of the most important things you can do once it's found is to remove those plants immediately from the area, because again, those spores are just, you tap on the plant a little bit and the spores are just gonna fly. And you want to remove it from the site. Don't leave it on the ground next to your crop, or leave it in a bin in the greenhouse. You know, remove it away. And avoiding injury, because I mentioned the pathogen needs an injury to cause infection. So overhead irrigation, if you can limit it so that the leaves don't remain wet. If there's any way to reduce humidity, using fans. And especially in greenhouse or high tunnel production. I wonder if we're still having issues with sound, Nick?
No, your sound is good. I'll help.
Okay, okay, thanks. And fungicides as well. There's a few conventional fungicides. Rovrel is one, quite common, but then neem oil could be an option that people have used for botrytis. Okay, so we're still on some of the uncommon diseases. I think a lot of you may have heard of beet curly top virus, especially if you grow tomatoes in particular. So this particular virus can be common, somewhat common, on tomatoes, pepper, but it can also affect spinach and beets. But it's far less common on those two crops. So it's a virus that's spread by a leafhopper. The leafhopper is a vector that can carry the virus from weeds to a plant or from a plant to a plant. And the beet leafhoppers actually cannot overwinter in northern Utah. So they overwinter in the south and they're blown north every year. Every spring and summer by migration or with the winds. And the virus itself can overwinter on certain weeds. Amaranth is probably one of the most common, or it's carried with the leafhoppers from the south. And so some of the symptoms on beets or spinach may look like this. In the top left is the initial stages of the symptoms where the foliage is chlorotic initially, and then that chlorotic foliage will then turn brown and die. And a lot of times on the lower left, you can see the plants just don't grow very well. Some tomatoes that are affected by curly top can still live for a while, but a lot of the spinach and beet plants eventually will die. So as far as management right now, there's no varieties of spinach or beet that are resistant, so that's not an option. But trying to control those weeds like the amaranth to reduce the overwintering potential is important. And the leafhoppers, they need kind of good line of sight to get to their plant hosts to feed. And so if you mix your plantings, maybe with, if you're able to, with one crop and then the next crop next to it, a different crop, it may make it more difficult for them to find the host plants. And then Nick Valesky has done a lot of work with the use of row covers to exclude the leafhoppers from the plants themselves. And he's also found some interesting things where the row covers are actually protecting the plants on the outside of the row covers, because it's just creating this big barrier, this big kind of obstacle that, again, they're not able to find those plants. Okay, so moving on to another disease group are the leaf spots. And these are in particular on spinach and chard. And again, pretty uncommon, but you know, it's still good to know all these different diseases to know what to expect. So one example is Stymphalium leaf spot. And I just want to actually point out here, you guys are probably familiar with scientific nomenclature. You have your genus and your species name. But in this name, it has this F and then SP and then Spinacia or spinach. So that FSP, just in case you ever see this, is Forma specialis. And it means that it's a specific isolate of this particular pathogen that when it affects spinach, it causes much greater disease than another isolate of the same pathogen. And so it just gives it that specialized name. So this is what is attacking spinach. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out if you see that. It can overwinter on the seed. It can also overwinter on the debris, or spinach debris on the ground. And in that spring, it spreads by spores under somewhat warm temperatures. And another example called Calatosporium also can spread on the seed, but it prefers cooler temperatures. And then the third example is called Cercospora, and this is spinach, beets, and chard. It overwinters on debris as well, but it spreads in warmer conditions, over 75 degrees. So just looking at some pictures of what these look like. So Stymphalium, and this is just on spinach. The initial infections are kind of a tan, almost olive colored spot. with a moisture or water-soaked border around each spot. So if you look at this one, it's sort of a lighter green color, soaked water looking border around the spot itself. And then it will be a more defined border around the spots as they age. They'll turn a tan color, they'll merge together and feel very dry and papery. And there's no fungal appearance to any of these spots. So it almost looks like it's affected by a chemical spray. So it can be a little bit misleading. So that's Stymphalium, Cladosporium, and this affects spinach and chard. The spots look pretty simple to what I just showed you in the initial infection, but there's not that sort of water-soaked border around the edge. It's more of a distinct border. And again, as these spots age, they'll grow and merge together. And then eventually there will be some fungal structures that will form in the middle of those spots. So these are spores, and they are kind of an olive green color. And then finally is their Cercospora spots. And they're pretty distinctive because the initial spots will be with a distinct border that's either purple or a purple to tan color. And again, as they age, they'll merge together to be a little blotchy, and there will be visible fungal structures in the middle of those lesions. So just to summarize here with the spots, Stymphalium on the far left, there's no fungal structures in the middle of the spots. The Cladosporium, you have the olive green, heavy spore production, and then the Cercospora is that distinct border, brown, purple to brown border around the spots. So I mentioned that some of these spots can actually be a little misleading and look like other causes. So I thought that I'd see what you guys can identify here. So here, this picture on the top left, is spinach with some spots on it. Maybe you can't tell exactly what it is, but if you want to type in chat, if you have any thoughts, or you can guess, is it a disease or is it something abiotic? And it might be hard to see. Okay, no one's taking a gander. All right, so this one, oh, yeah, we have some hail. That would actually be a really good guess. The real answer is herbicide burn, but still, all you guys' answers, hail is a good one. Now this one, let me go back. The herbicide is the lesions kind of cross over the veins. They're a little blotchy, whereas in this picture, the lesions are in between the veins. So I don't know if that helps a little bit with making another guess here, and I'll go ahead and tell you this is water stress. Okay. Now here, maybe someone can guess this. So it's lesions on the edge or the margin of the leaf. And this could actually be around the entire leaf, but it's only on the margins. Anyone want to take a guess at that? Sun scorch, that's a good one. Salt, yes. Yes, good, you guys. Salt or fertilizer burn. Now this one's a little more difficult, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you. This leaf feels, good guess, but the foliage that's yellow or white in color actually feels the same as the green foliage. So there's no, the foliage has not been affected by where the color variation is. And what it's called is a chimera. And that's just kind of a mutation where you just get this variation of color in the leaf, but the leaf is still perfectly healthy. And then someone already said leaf miner, and actually that was my last one. So when leaf miner first gets started, it can sometimes look like it might be a disease. All right, so just some lookalikes for leaf spots. But managing leaf spots, I mentioned some of those can overwinter on the crop debris. So that debris could be incorporated into the soil, buried in, or removed. It can also spread from diseased seed. So starting with that certified disease-free seed, actually make sure you're doing that anyway. Whenever you're buying seed, make sure it's certified disease-free. And then rotating to non-host crops outside of the spinach family for about 3 years or so. Irrigation, of course, the water overhead is going to affect a lot of diseases, in particular leaf spots. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the last 2 diseases, and they're both rare, but has been found in Utah. So the first is called lettuce drop, and it is actually caused by a pathogen that has a very wide host range and causes a lot of different diseases on many crops. But on lettuce, it's just called lettuce drop. And so it's a fungus called Sclerotinia sclerotiorum. And it causes a foliar infection, and eventually those leaves just kind of flop to the ground, flat to the ground, giving its name leaf drop. And it overwinters and can survive for several years in the soil as these little black pellets that you can just see with the naked eye. They're called sclerotia. And then this picture on the bottom, it's a little hard to see, but all these little black areas are sclerotia. And there's a hole here in the soil where a lettuce plant has been pulled out. So I already mentioned it has a real wide host range. There was someone who was growing sunflower in a high tunnel and had huge problems with this disease because I think there was a weed in there that was growing beforehand. And so they weren't able to grow anything in that greenhouse for a long time after that. And it took a little time to figure out what the problem was. But I just wanted to point out that it says rare here, but because it has such a wide host range, there is the potential for it to affect some crop that you might grow. But it's very distinctive in its appearance. Shown on the lower left, it has been found on kale, but as I mentioned, lettuce is more common with the leafy greens. But you'll see that mass of hyphae, fungal hyphae, at the base of the plant, very bright white. So you really you can't misdiagnose this disease. And then a very strong wet rot, again, toppling that plant over. And then the formation of these black sclerotia right at the base of the plant. Just when people may have to deal with this, they can deep plow the sclerotia into the soil surface or rotate with non-hosts or use some fungicides. So I'm just going to finish up with the last disease here, downy mildew of spinach. And this is a rare, and the reason it's rare is it's only been found in Utah in a greenhouse. So as far as I know, unless Nick wants to correct me, it has not been found out in field production. And I think in the greenhouse where it was found, it was introduced through disease seed. So anyway, this is a very serious disease in the east where conditions are a lot more humid and wet. So it's a fungal relative pathogen, and it overwinters on debris, or as I mentioned, it can be brought in by seed. And this video I have here is actually grape downy mildew, but it's the same idea. So here's some overwintering foliage, and the graphic is showing that in spring, spores will start to form, and under the right conditions, which will be rain falling on that crop debris and splashing the spores up, there'll be infection on the foliage. So when the spores land, they need to enter the plant through a stomate. And then the fungus, so it's entering through the stomate, this fungus will grow through the plant cells, the epidermis, and form heavy amounts of spores on the leaf surface, cause new infections, and that cycle continues again and again and again. And so that's why where this disease occurs, it can be quite devastating. So the symptoms on the foliage is kind of mottled green color wherever those infections have occurred. And on the underside of the leaf is the copious formation of those spores, again, causing new infections. So people that are managing downy mildew on spinach, they'll rotate their crops, incorporate residues, but also thankfully there's a lot of resistant varieties available, and this list is maybe a third of the total number of varieties that could be used, and then some fungicides too. So with that, I'll just finish up by saying, and Nick may mention this as well, that you may be familiar with the Utah Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab that can answer any unknowns that you may discover in your own farm or garden in terms of needing it diagnosed. So it is a fee, $10 on up. They can culture fungi, bacteria. They can do different tests for viruses and other diseases. So I'm gonna finish up there, maybe give you guys a minute or two if you have any questions. This is my contact info. If you wanted to take that down, you know, we're always available to answer your questions. I know you have Nick as your vegetable expert, but if you guys don't have any questions, then we can flip it over to Nick.
Awesome. And then just to verify, Marion, are you seeing the full screen?
Not yet. I'm seeing your, like where you would just open the PowerPoint.
Okay, what about now?
Now we're seeing your presentation view with notes.
Okay. Now you should be able to see it, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Mayor. So now we're going to move on to the next portion of this webinar. And I'm going to be covering some insect pests that you may come across in your leafy green production in Utah. So this is not going to be a comprehensive list of all the insects, but rather just highlighting some of the major ones that our growers might see. So as a review, leafy greens or salad greens, they're very popular to grow in Utah. Obviously, all you guys are watching because you grow leafy greens in your garden or your farm. You might enjoy them to eat yourself, or you might sell them at the farmer's market. And they can potentially be grown year-round with the right facilities and management. But typically the pest pressure, that usually occurs in the traditional outdoor growing season from the spring into the fall. And when I discuss leafy greens, I categorize them as those in the Asteraceae family. So those can be our endives and radicchios. We have the brassica family, so arugula, other mustards, collards, kales. Then we have different types of lettuces, so our bib, cos, iceberg, and butterheads. And then of course we have beet greens, spinach, and Swiss chard. So some insects might prefer specific leafy greens. Some might prefer all leafy greens. But for this presentation, I'll like talk about the specifics for each insect. But in general, we're just going to talk about the insects as a whole and the crops as a whole. So first up, we have aphids. There are over 250 species of aphids that are considered pests to agronomic and ornamental crops. And aphids, they're super small. They're pear-shaped and they have soft bodies and they suck sap from our plant tissues. They're no bigger than about 5 millimeters. And they're identifiable because they have these tailpipe-like appendages called cornicles at the rear end of their body. And depending on the species, the color and texture can range. So I just listed 8 examples of aphids you might see on your leafy green crops. The first one we have is the cabbage aphid. And this is notable because of the white powder. And this is actually a mealy secretion that these aphids are giving off. And then cabbage aphids, their main hosts are brassica crops, but for leafy greens, they like collards, kale, and arugula. Next we have the green peach aphid, and these are super common here in Utah. And these are also the ones that vector a lot of viruses. And they like arugula, chard, endive, and lettuce. And then their winter woody hosts are trees in the prunus genus. So these can be like peach trees, apricot, or plums. Next is the mellid aphids. They like spinach, and their woody hosts are rose of Sharon and then catalpa trees. And then the potato aphid can actually be green or pink. And then the picture I have is in its pink form. And its host includes beets, horseradish, kale, mustard, and sometimes spinach, arugula, and then lettuce in the fall. And its winter hosts include roses. So looking at this bottom row, the first one is the black bean aphid. These guys, they like beets, lettuce, spinach, chard, and rhubarb. And then their woody host includes trees and shrubs in the Euonymus and Viburnum families. Next is the mustard aphid. Sometimes we'll call them turnip aphids, but they like kale, collards, and mustards. And then the currant lettuce aphid likes chicory, radicchio, and lettuce. And then their woody hosts are gooseberries and red and black currants. And then last but not least is the poplar lettuce aphid. And these ones are fun because they look like the cabbage aphids because they have that white powdery secretion, but they're different from other aphids because they don't have the cornicles on their rear end. And they primarily like chicory, endive, and lettuce. And then their winter host is poplar trees. So when we talk about aphids, especially vegetable aphids, they all have similar life cycles with a few exceptions. One being cabbage aphids, they overwinter as eggs on the same brassica crops as they are in the summertime. So in the winter, like if we leave our plant debris out there, that's where those eggs are going to overwinter. And if you live down in Washington County, you might find them overwintering as adults. But most other aphid species, they'll overwinter as eggs on the woody host. So like on that previous slide, I was talking about all the different wintering sites. That's where you'll find the eggs. So eggs will hatch as all females in the spring. And then these adults, they'll reproduce asexually throughout the summer. And then they'll migrate to those overwintering sites in the fall. And then, of course, as you know, aphids are a problem because they have these piercing, sucky mouth parts, and that can cause the leaves to become distorted. So if you look at that top right photo, that's a spinach leaf, and it's become all shriveled and distorted. And that's something you can't sell at the farmer's market or something you would want to consume. And then aphids, they can also secrete a sticky substance, like a honeydew, we call it. And that can also attract mold growth, which we don't want on our plants either. So to manage aphids, you want to scout frequently. Aphid colonies, they can build up very quick. So it's super important to scout your leafy greens at least twice a week, especially when they're first young and growing rapidly. You want to check the undersides of the leaves where the aphids like to congregate. And you want to look for ant activity too, because usually when there's ants, that's a sign of aphids, because those ants like the honeydew that the aphids are secreting. And then once an aphid starts, or once the aphid feeding starts curling the leaves of your crops, that's when it's going to become more difficult to reduce their numbers. So you definitely want to manage early on. The greatest damage occurs when temperatures are warm but not too hot. So we usually say around 65 to 80 degrees. And then to manage, you want to avoid excessive fertilization, because aphid densities tend to be higher when plants have a lot of succulent and vigorous growth going on. So another option is to apply row covers, because you're physically excluding the aphids from the plants. You want to remove and destroy plant debris at the end of the season, because like I said, that can serve as an overwintering site for the cabbage aphids. You want to remove and destroy nearby weeds during the season too, because those can serve as an alternate host and a potential virus reservoir. And then, of course, you can encourage natural enemies. And some that we all know are the lady beetles, lacewings, syrphid flies, and then parasitic wasps. And you can actually purchase a lot of these from biocontrol companies. And within an enclosed setting, like a high tunnel, maybe a row cover or greenhouse, these can be highly effective. But if you're just releasing them into kind of the outdoor open field, it's not really likely that they'll stay near your crops. They'll just scatter. A lot of aphid species have developed resistance to insecticides, so you want to use them sparingly. And besides, a lot of people who are selling leafy greens, they're going to be organic growers at the market, so you're not going to want to sell something that's been sprayed. But there are organic insecticide products out there, like pyrethrins, azactarins, acetamprids, and then there's products with the, I think it's a fungus for cold area pathogen. And then there's a bacterium called Chromobacterium substigae, which is a biocontrol. And there's, of course, people like to use insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils like neem oil for aphid control. So next, I'm going to talk about armyworms. So first, I see you guys' questions in the chat. I'll try to get to them at the end of the presentation. So next we have armyworms and cutworms. So both armyworms and cutworms, they're the larvae stage of the moths in the Noctuidae family. And I put some images of common army and cutworm species that may attack your leafy greens here in Utah. But again, this isn't a comprehensive list. These are just some common ones. But keep in mind that they are all managed pretty similar. So armyworms, the adult moths are gray with brown and light colored markings. The larvae vary in color from tan to green to almost black color, and they can have different markings. The larvae, they feed on the foliage with their chewing mouth parts, and that can cause irregular holes in the leaves and sometimes complete defoliation. In armyworms, they're typically a concern from mid-July through September, and they'll develop, or their life cycle is the egg, larva, which is about 6 to 9 stages or instars, we call them, and then the pupa, and then adult. And then for armyworms, the pupae is the one that overwinters in the soil. And then you'll find the eggs usually on the leaves of the crops or nearby weeds. And then as the larvae matures, it'll disperse and move toward the center of the plant, or sometimes you'll see it on the ground or the soil. So cutworms are kind of similar. Like the adult moths are gray with brown light colored markings. The larvae, they'll range from a dull gray to brown. And then when the cutworms are disturbed, or if you poke at it, it'll turn into like a C when it's disturbed. And then these larvae also have the chewy mouth parts. And they can actually clip off seedlings, which is why we call them cutworms. And they're actually most active during the spring and early summer months, sometimes as early as January into April. So if you're someone that uses a high tunnel or row covers or does winter production, I'd be curious to know if you got, or what's the earliest that you've seen cutworms out. And the life cycle, again, is the egg, larvae, pupa, and adult. And then the larvae are the ones that overwinter in the soil or underneath plant debris. So to manage them, the best way is just to keep your farm or your garden area weed free, especially of lamb's quarter and wild mustard weeds. These weeds can serve as an alternate host that can attract adult moths. Another option is to till your soil in the fall. This can disrupt the overwintering pupae or larva stage. And again, row covers are great because they physically exclude the adults from laying their eggs on your plants. And if you just have a small garden or a smaller operation, some people use something as called, or they use like cardboard collars. So you can see in this top left picture, it kind of looks like a toilet paper roll that's around the plant. And this can help prevent the cutworm from accessing that seedling. And then of course, the best management is just hand removal. So you can pick them off and put them in a soapy bucket, especially if you're just in a home garden. And then of course, I've listed some insecticide sprays. So some organic ones include BT, which is Bacillus thuringiensis, if I pronounce that right. We just call it BT. And then there's spinosad. These are super popular organic options, and they're really effective, especially on the younger caterpillars and in the earlier instars. So next we have everyone's favorite, slugs and snails. So these are probably the worst garden pests that everyone takes issue with. And they're obviously not insects, they're actually mollusks. And they're closely related to shellfish, such as mussels and clams. And slugs and snails, they have similar characteristics, except the snails, you can see in the photo, they have that spiral shell, and then the slugs don't. And both, they'll glide with the long, flat, muscular organ called the foot. So if you look at the diagrams, is on the bottom side, that muscle is called the foot. So there is a mucus or slime secreted by the foot of the slug and snails, and that's what helps them move. But this can dry and leave kind of a gross white trail indicating the presence of the slug or snail. And if you're selling leafy greens at the farmer's market with that white trail, no one's going to buy that. So that's why it's super important that we manage this pest. And these pests, they're active at night or on dark, cloudy days. And then during the day, they'll seek relief from the sun and heat in shady areas like under plants, rocks, wood, or compost piles. And they need moisture to thrive, but somehow they still survive in dry conditions like Utah, again, by just hiding in protected areas. And slugs and snails, they're actually hermaphrodites, so meaning they're not male and they're not female, but they're all capable of reproducing. And they can lay multiple clusters of eggs throughout the entire growing season. So if you look at the photos on the right side, they're kind of like these little white pearl balls laid in clusters. So to manage slugs and snails, well, first you want to know that they eat a wide variety of vegetable crops and ornamental crops, and they especially like our leafy greens. So you can see that photo on the bottom left where you see a bunch of slugs chowing down on some lettuce. And they can chew irregular holes that have those smooth edges on the leaves. So to manage them, the best thing you could do is just remove damp and dark hiding places. You don't want to over irrigate your crops. Another option that small farms and home gardeners use is copper barriers. So when slugs and snails, they'll if they were to hit copper, they'll receive like an electric shock that prevents them. So if you look in this top middle photo, you can see there's some individual plants that have a copper ring around them. And then we have a raised bed garden with like a copper strip. And that's been proven to prevent slugs. Another option that smaller growers like is diatomaceous earth. And if you're not familiar with diatomaceous earth, it's basically crushed up old fossilized shells and kind of like a powder. And like if you look at this top photo, they sprinkled it around their plant. And the idea is that this crushed up shells, it's really sharp. So the slugs and snails, they wouldn't be able to crawl over it because that would cut them up. However, if it gets wet, it becomes unpractical because then it just softens and then the slugs can get over it. So it's not super effective for larger production areas, but it might work well in smaller areas. And then finally, we have traps. So we call them bait traps. So this can be like a cup, a piece of Tupperware, or like in this picture, they used, it looks like a water bottle where they cut the top off and flipped it upside down. But you put that into the soil near your host plants. And then for bait options, what's most effective is iron phosphate or metaldehyde. And then I listed some of those products there. But some producers, they've had luck using beer, yeast, or a honey mixture for the bait. But the idea is the slugs or snails will get attracted and then they'll fall in and can't get out. And then lastly, there's natural predators for slugs and snails. So if you find snakes, toads, frogs, or birds in your yard, that's a good thing because they're probably feeding on the slugs and snails. Okay, so next we have flea beetles. Flea beetles, they're super common in Utah and they're super problematic too. You will find them in the late spring and the summer, in the early summer. And one of the species we have is crucifer flea beetles. They have a wide host range, primarily cabbage, kale, and mustard greens. We have the western black flea beetle, though they like plants in the brassica family, beet greens, and lettuce. And then we have the three spotted flea beetle, which likes beet greens, spinach, Swiss chard, cabbage, horseradish, and lettuce. So I'll just talk about flea beetles. Flea beetles all as one because we manage them the same. So the adults, they're typically about 1.5 to 4 millimeters long. They have enlarged femoral hind legs, which allow them to jump, and that's where they get the name flea beetle. So if you look in this bottom middle picture, this is a photo I took actually. It's a side view of the flea beetle, and you can see how big those back legs are that allow them to jump. Most flea beetle species, they overwinter as adults in protected places. In the spring, they will mate and lay their eggs at the soil base of desired host plants. And then eggs will hatch into the larva stage, which lasts about a month. Then those larvae will pupate, which will allow for a second generation of adults in the summer. Flea beetle adults, they can cause a lot of damage to the foliage by chewing holes or leaving pits. So if you look in this first photo, I have a picture of kale, and you can see that extensive flea beetle damage. And once that happens, it's not something you can sell at the market or something you would want to consume. So here's the top two photos show some more flea beetle damage on mustard greens and arugula. It is super important to monitor for flea beetles on susceptible plants, especially in the spring. So you want to check seedlings at least 2 times a week until they grow out of their vulnerable stage. In the mature plants, treatment may be necessary when the flea beetle populations are high or in plants that are more susceptible to feeding, such as leafy greens. Sticky traps are a great monitoring tool, and they can provide a guideline almost of when the flea beetles are present and at what quantity and when you should start monitoring. You can get yellow sticky traps or you can get white sticky traps. Both work well. And they should be placed around the susceptible host plants just as they're beginning to emerge. So to manage, again, row covers, and I've mentioned row covers for every pest so far, so you know they're pretty effective because they serve, again, as that physical barrier, excluding the adults, flea beetles from getting to the crops. So I'm going to talk about trap cropping, and these are basically plants that are highly attractive to flea beetles that can serve as the trap crop. Trap crops lure flea beetles away from the desired crop and can be destroyed or sprayed to decrease the flea beetle population. You want to plant the trap crop about 2 to 4 weeks before the cash crop so that the larger, well-maintained trap crop will be more attractive to the flea beetles. So some examples of successful trap crops are the Chinese Southern Giant Mustard, radish, pak choy, and the Pacific Gold Mustard. So once flea beetles start to feed on the trap crop, their populations can be managed. Now, similar to trap cropping, but a little bit different, is companion planting. Companion planting can confuse, repel, or block insects from finding the host plants. Bunching green onions, dill, and marigold is a good example of companion planting that has been used for flea beetle management. Intercropping or planting companion plants next to the host plant will enhance plant diversity and make the desired crop less apparent to the beetles. Companion plants can also be used in combination with trap crops to increase the success of pest control. And then the companion plants repel flea beetles away, and then the trap crop attracts them. So this is kind of like a push-pull strategy. So I put some diagrams on the right side of these two methods. And it's kind of it's simple, but it's still complicated. It's something you'd have to look at a lot of literature to make sure you're doing it right. And if this is something that you're interested in trying out on your farm, you can let me know. I would gladly get involved and help you out to see how you could make trap cropping and companion planting work. And then finally, there's a lot of generalist predators for flea beetle. So the lacewing larvae, big-eyed bugs, damsel bugs, these all feed on flea beetles. And then additionally, there's a specific parasitoid wasp that likes to kill some species of adult flea beetles. And a lot of these beneficial insects are attracted to nectar and pollen producing plants, such as clover, dill, and marigold. And then, of course, we have pesticides. So although foliar application of insecticides is the most common management tactic for flea beetles, insecticides should only be used if necessary. Since plants produce continuous new growth and these highly mobile insects can rapidly reinvade plantings, insecticides may have to be applied more than once to cover the plant's susceptible period. And then I listed some synthetic and organic insecticide options on this chart you see on the right. So leaf miners, which some of you guys were asking about in the chat. So the word or the term leaf miner commonly describes the larval stage of various insects, but those that specifically feed on vegetable crops, they're usually this small yellow and black fly in the order Diptera. And in Utah, we have 3 species of leaf miner flies that attack our vegetable crops. We have the American serpentine leaf miner, we have the pea leaf miner, and then the vegetable leaf miner. They all look pretty much the same, a few slight differences. The adults are small, about 2 millimeters in length, and the wing length is about, or sorry, not 2 millimeters, 2 centimeters in length. And then the wing length is about equal or slightly longer than the body. The flies have yellow heads and grayish black bodies. and with the yellow markings on their undersides. And then the wings are dark in color, and then they're folded horizontal over the back when it's resting. And you can kind of see that in these photos I have. And then on the top right, you can see the eggs. They're super small. They're white or yellowish, and they're that oval shape. And then the bottom pictures, I have the larvae, which is basically a legless maggot that can be transparent immediately after hatching, and then it can change to a white or cream color, and they'll turn yellow as they age. And then the bottom right, I have a picture of the pupa, and then the pupa can range from a gold to a reddish color, and these are usually about 1.5 to 3.5 milliliters long. So leafminers, they overwinter in the soil as pupae with adult flies emerging in the spring and summer. And then after they mate, the females, they'll use their ovipositor, which is the egg-laying structure, to puncture the leaf surface. And so when they hatch, the larvae will be able to feed inside the leaf. And the eggs will usually hatch quickly when the temperatures start to warm in the spring. So they're usually only there for about 2 to 4 days. And then when the larvae hatch, they do this. They create these mines within the leaves. And this is the major damage to the plant. And it's caused by their feeding. And their feeding between the leaves is mesophyll layers. And it creates these blisters, blotchy mines, and serpentine tunneling. And it just makes your leafy greens unmarketable because nobody's going to buy, no one's going to buy salad greens with fly maggots. So with the heavy feeding, with this heavy feeding damage, the photosynthesis is reduced and the leaves may dry and drop, which can result in decreased plant quantity and yield. And it gets more serious as the season goes on. So to manage these, first thing you can do is check the transplants for signs of leaf mines or white stippling before planting. You want to destroy those infested plants. And then again, we have row covers. You can see in that top picture because you're excluding the adult flies from laying their eggs onto your crops. Immediately after the final harvest, you want to remove all the plant debris and deeply plow the residue and get rid of that overwintering pupal stage. And then there's some parasitic wasp you can actually buy and release, which I've talked about before with other insects. And finally, there's some insecticide options available, but these are really challenging to use because that larvae, remember, they're protected in between the two leaf layers. So it'd be hard for any product to access them. Okay, so we're a little over time, but I just have one more pest I want to cover, and that's the cabbage maggot. And the cabbage maggot most commonly attacks crops like cabbage, collards, kale, kohlrabi, and mustards. Cabbage maggot pupa is the overwintering stage, and that happens in the soil and debris near the surface. Adults will emerge in early May, and then the mated females will lay their eggs in the soil at the base of the host plant. And the cabbage maggot larvae feeds on the roots, and it'll tunnel into the roots. And that'll leave the opening as kind of a source for different fungi or bacteria to infect the plant. And then usually the damaged plants will show wilting and reduced growth. So if you look at these pictures, the adult is a little fly, and then you can see the maggots. And then the right picture shows the different maggots burrowing into the root of a kale plant. And then the bottom photo is kind of a cross section of the stem and root, and you can see the maggots inside. And then the bottom left photo shows how the kale plant's just wilting because of the cabbage maggots. So to manage, After the susceptible crops emerge, watch for wilting and reduced growth. Any signs of chlorosis could be a sign. If cabbage maggots are suspected, you can pull up the infected plant and check the roots to see if you can find the maggot if they're present. If not, that means they're probably in the pupa stage already. So another option is crop rotation. So plant susceptible host as far away as possible from where they were planted last year with the non-susceptible host crop. Another option is immediately after the harvest, you want to destroy the crop residue. You want to till the soil, disc it, get rid of that pupa stage. And then there are some biological control options. So that can include natural predators like carabid beetles, rogue beetles, and parasitic wasps. Those can all help suppress cabbage beetle or cabbage maggots. However, biological control alone usually isn't enough to suppress the populations. So you want to look at some of these other cultural control options. And then if you're in an area where cabbage maggots are causing a lot of economic injury, then you could consider insecticides that you can treat at the base of the plants where the cabbage maggots are usually present. And I listed some of those, some organic options and then a synthetic option as well. So that is cabbage maggots. And again, those were just some of the pests I covered. And like Mare mentioned earlier, we have our Utah Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab. So if you guys find an insect or diseased plant, feel free to send that to our lab and we can help you identify it and help you figure out how to best manage for it. Also, if you go check out our new snazzy website, extension.usu.edu/pest, you can find some educational how-to videos. We have free guide ebooks, informative fact sheets, and then you'll find recorded webinar presentations. You'll find this one on there if you want to refer back to it. Then if you're not already, you guys need to subscribe to our pest advisories. These are timely email alerts on insects and diseases to look out for. We have them for fruit, vegetable, turf, and landscape pests. And then I want to refer you guys to our Utah Vegetable Production and Pest Management Guide. We have a free PDF version online. We also have a companion website that covers all the same information in the digital format. If you guys want a hard copy of this book, you can get it at the USU Extension store online for $20. And so I mentioned earlier, if you guys signed up for a pesticide use CEU credit, I'm going to copy and paste this into the chat. But what you need to do is you need to answer this question and then you need to email it to Drew Matthews at the UDAP office. So all you have to do is you need to match each of these terms with the description. So which one of these best describes cultural control, which one describes chemical control, biological control, and mechanical control. So again, if you want a pesticide use CEU credit, copy and paste what I just put into the chat, and then you want to compose an email. If you guys have more questions about that, you can feel free to contact me. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and put them into the chat. I saw that Mare was answering most of them, but let me know if you have any other ones as well.
There was one question I didn't get to. For leaf miners, do you suggest an insecticide for management?
Yeah, so with the leaf miners, they're really hard to manage with the insecticides because remember, they're the maggots and they're in between the two layers of the mesophyll of the leaf. So it's really challenging for any insecticide product to hit and access that maggot. So that's why we usually recommend doing those cultural practices to manage them, or just removing the leaves when you find them. Cool. So if you guys have any other questions, I put my email in there. You can ask me or Mare anytime. I see questions about earwigs and Sluggo Plus. I can, Jacqueline, if you email me, I can answer that for you too. I won't answer it here tonight. But again, contact me and I'll help you out. So I'm going to go ahead and end this webinar. Thank you guys for joining. On Thursday night, I'll be joined by, or no, I'm sorry, Wednesday night, I'll be joined by Kaylin, and we'll be doing one on root crops and different diseases and insect pests. So join us Wednesday night, 7 p.m., this exact same link. So I will see you guys all then. Thank you.